Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a wild, true crime mystery from the early 20th century, and we're going to use it to unpack a massive, centuries-old debate about the ethics of art, war, and national identity. Specifically, we're looking at the world's most famous painting, a notorious art heist, and how the heavy shadow of Napoleonic plunder still hangs over the collections of our greatest modern museums. Let's get right into it. Okay, so our story starts with a really surprising number, 28. Back in 1911, the Mona Lisa was stolen, literally right off the walls of the Louvre in Paris. But here's the crazy part. It took 28 hours for anyone at the museum to even realize it was missing. I know, right? Before this theft, the Mona Lisa was definitely respected by art critics, but it was absolutely not the global pop culture icon it is today. Honestly, it wasn't even the most famous painting in its own room.
Section 1. The world's greatest art heist. So once the museum finally realized the painting had vanished, an absolute media frenzy erupted. Thousands of Parisians literally queued up just to stare at the blank wall where the Mona Lisa used to hang. It's wild. It really proves that fame is kind of a feedback loop, you know? The more the newspapers covered the heist, the more valuable and famous that absent painting became.
As the investigation spiraled out of control, the Paris police got desperate. And I mean desperate. They rounded up a truly wild list of suspects. You had your usual museum insiders and master thieves, sure, but then the paranoia really set in. People honestly thought American millionaires, like J.P. Morgan, were secretly orchestrating the whole thing to steal French heritage. They dragged in the famous poet Guillaume Apollinaire. And, incredibly, building up to the absolute most shocking name on the list, they hauled in Pablo Picasso.
There's actually an academic paper detailing this exact bizarre historical event, the Affaire des Statuettes. It shows that Pablo Picasso, yes, the soon-to-be absolute titan of modern art, was genuinely brought in by the police and interrogated over the theft of the Mona Lisa. And Picasso was terrified. He was so scared he actually lied under oath, claiming he didn't even know his good friend Apollinaire. But wait, why was he panicking so much if he didn't actually steal the Mona Lisa?
Well, the truth was actually much stranger. Picasso was totally innocent of the Mona Lisa theft, but he was actually guilty of possessing other stolen Louvre artifacts. Yeah, several years prior, an acquaintance had stolen these ancient Iberian statue heads from the Louvre, where, by the way, security was notoriously terrible, and sold them to Picasso for just 50 francs. Picasso actually used them as direct inspiration for his groundbreaking painting, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. And he just kept these genuinely stolen artifacts hidden right in the bottom of his sock drawer. Section 2. A misguided patriotic defense. Okay, so Picasso was eventually cleared, obviously. The actual thief turned out to be Vincenzo Peruggia. He was an Italian handyman who had literally helped build the protective glass cases at the Louvre. His master plan? He just hid in a supply closet overnight, tucked the masterpiece under his work smock, and basically just walked out the door. He kept it stashed in his Paris apartment for 2 whole years before finally getting busted in Florence. Now, once he was caught, Peruggia claimed he was this pure patriot. He argued he was simply repatriating Italian heritage, taking back what the French Emperor Napoleon had stolen from Italy a century earlier. And the Italian public actually ate this up. They loved the narrative and treated him like a national hero. But his private letters tell a slightly different story. He was secretly writing to his father, bragging about how he was going to make his fortune in one shot and secure a massive payday for the family. So maybe not quite the selfless patriot. But here is the ultimate historical twist that completely shatters Peruggia's patriotic excuse. Are you ready for this? He stole the wrong painting. The Mona Lisa was actually never plundered by Napoleon. Leonardo da Vinci himself brought the painting with him to France way back in 1516 and legally gifted or sold it to King Francis I. So it had been legitimate French royal property for 250 years before Napoleon was even born. Peruggia's whole historical justification was completely, fundamentally flawed. Section 3. The reality of Napoleonic plunder. But here's the thing. While Peruggia was dead wrong about the Mona Lisa, he was totally 100% right about the broader reality of Napoleonic plunder. Napoleon Bonaparte oversaw one of the most massive state-sponsored art thefts in human history. And that brings us to the real core of today's explainer. The raw data here is just staggering. During his Italian campaigns in the late 1790s, Napoleon's forces systematically targeted the cultural heritage of the Italian states. We're not talking about casual, chaotic looting by soldiers. They brought actual art experts with them to handpick the absolute finest pieces.
From Italy alone, an estimated 506 major works of art were forcefully removed. And even after Napoleon's eventual defeat, only about half were returned. A whopping 248 of those plundered masterpieces just stayed in France.
And we are talking about monumental, irreplaceable works of art here. A prime example is Paulo Veronese's The Wedding Feast at Cana. This painting is absolutely massive. We're talking nearly 7 by 10 meters. It was painted back in 1563, specifically designed for the wall of a monastery in Venice. In 1797, French troops literally ripped it off the wall. They even sliced the massive canvas in two, just so they could roll it up and ship it back to Paris as a spoil of war. Just brutal.
So how did they rationalize this? How did the French Republic, which, remember, preached liberty, equality, and fraternity, justify mass cultural theft? Well, the French Directory essentially argued that because France was the new beacon of liberty in the world, they were the true spiritual heirs to the genius of the Italian Renaissance. They honestly believed that masterpieces belonged in the country of liberty to legitimize their new empire. Their official stance was, quote, "The time has come when their reign must pass to France to solidify and embellish that of liberty." Unbelievable, right?
Section 4. The Congress of Vienna. So this state-sponsored looting just continued unabated until Napoleon's ultimate defeat, which leads us to a massive diplomatic summit in 1815. Now, this represents a huge turning point in history because for the first time on a grand international scale, the very ethics of military conquest and cultural plunder were being put on trial. At the Congress of Vienna, the Allied powers pushed back hard against France. They attempted to set a brand new ethical standard for the world, that victorious nations are not justified in simply stripping conquered lands of their cultural treasures. They demanded the restitution, the legal return of the art that French armies had seized across Europe. It was a genuinely groundbreaking moment for the whole concept of protecting cultural heritage. The Pope actually sent the famous Italian sculptor Antonio Canova to negotiate the return of Italian art, and Canova was passionate. He stated, "I would never have betrayed the interest and honor of my fatherland, nor approved of such an exchange," and he fought tooth and nail for his country's heritage. But it wasn't a total victory. For example, French officials flat out refused to return Veronese's The Wedding Feast at Cana. Their excuse? They claimed it was too fragile to survive the journey back to Venice, which is incredibly rich, conveniently ignoring the fact that they had literally sliced it in half to bring it to Paris in the first place. Section 5. Art and National Identity. And this brings us to the deep philosophical debate at the very core of this explainer. Why does all of this matter so much? Why did Canova fight so hard back in 1815? And why did a handyman like Vincenzo Peruggia risk going to prison a century later in 1911? Well, in cultural ethics, there's this really fascinating concept known as mana. The idea is that art isn't just, wood, canvas, and paint. It actually contains the intangible essence, the soul, and the history of the people who created it. When a masterpiece is displayed in its home country, it exudes that shared heritage. Therefore, stealing a nation's art is interpreted not just as mere property theft, but as a direct, visceral attack on the identity and the spirit of the citizens themselves. The historian Hugh Trevor Roper summarized this perfectly with a brutally vivid metaphor. He said that conquering nation-states plundered like cannibals, who, by devouring parts of their enemies, think thereby to acquire their mana. By forcibly taking the greatest cultural artifacts of the defeated, empires like Napoleon's were literally trying to devour and absorb the strength, the prestige, and the historical legitimacy of those cultures. They take the art to absorb the mana. Section 6, the ethics of modern museums, which naturally forces us to look at the present day. Institutions like the Louvre are incredible, right? They are these massive global centers of education and beauty. But many of their foundational collections were built during this exact era of military conquest. So how should a 21st century institution address a 19th century plunder? Well, there are two really distinct sides to this ethical debate today. Argument 1 suggests that heritage just isn't static. After spending over 220 years in Paris, deeply integrated into French history and seen by millions of people, works like the Veronese have effectively absorbed a new, legitimate French identity. But on the other hand, argument 2 states that time simply doesn't erase a crime. Having a provenance label of military conquest is ethically at odds with modern museum standards, and true justice demands restitution to the original creators. Both sides make compelling points. It's an incredibly complex issue with absolutely no easy answers.
A handyman's misguided theft of the Mona Lisa in 1911 accidentally shone a spotlight on a much larger, state-sponsored theft from a century prior. And it leaves us with this final, provocative question to ponder. If heritage can shift over hundreds of years, to whom does plundered history truly belong today? Is it the creators or the conquerors? Think about that the next time you walk through the halls of a grand museum. Thanks for joining us on This Explainer.